Yogena chittasya padena vacham malam sarirasya cha vaidyakena yopakrutam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi stuve patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam kartrasutrasya bhashyasya kramadvivaranasya cha. We were discussing that important subject which is very well known in the Vedanta tradition, that is Tasya Vachaka Pranava. Of course, there's one fundamental difference. In the yoga tradition, Patanjali defines Pranava or Onkara as the Vachaka, that word that indicates the object, that is Ishvara, is Pranava. But in Vedanta, Pranava is not the Vachaka of the absolute reality, because the absolute reality cannot be defined. It is beyond definition, it is beyond description, it is indescribable, and it is the highest spiritual truth which can only be experienced as at the center of our own being, as non-distinct from the essence of our own being. But of course, this yoga philosophy, like Sankhya philosophy, is a pluralistic system. It is a kind of dualism. It doesn't correspond to the teachings of Advaita. So that difference should be kept in mind. The 28th Sutra, Tajjabaha Tadarthabhavanam. So that Pranava, Japa or proper recitation of this Pranava, it should be done with Arthabhavana. Means you should meditate on the meaning of this Pranava. So, in other words, when a spiritual seeker practices Onkara Japa, he should concentrate on the reality of God. That is an important point to remember. In fact, that is the fundamental difference between the Sankhya philosophy and Yoga philosophy. They are interrelated. They are, in fact, the Yoga system borrows a lot of its philosophical doctrines from the Sankhya system, but with this fundamental difference, the Yoga accepts Ishvara and the Sankhya doesn't accept Ishvara. Of course, the original Sankhya of Kapila. Now, this is an important subject. Tajjapaha tadarthabhavanam. How to practice japa? This is a very important thing. In all spiritual disciplines involving word symbols, there is one fundamental principle. When we do it in a more subtle manner, when we do it as an internal mental process, the effect, the spiritual benefit is much more. When we do it more externally, then the effect is less. Effect is not non-existent, but is comparatively less. To give a simple example before entering the subject. Suppose you have got some, let us say, in Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, some prayers. It's there in Buddhist tradition, Sikh tradition, Jaina tradition, Hinduism, and also in the Christian tradition, Jesus prayer and so on. It's there. Now, if you utter this prayer, which actually is actually a kind of a counterpart of this Pranava. Pranava is so subtle, it goes beyond any word as such. It is the essence of the entire existence. So it is not a word, because when you utter a word, when you reduce something to a word, then you are excluding everything else except what you indicate by that word. But if you utter the word Om, really speaking, it corresponds to the entire reality of existence. Because as I mentioned earlier, Akara, Ukara and Makara, these three letters are pronounced, articulated by opening the mouth, by closing the mouth, and also the middle, half closed, half open. So they together constitute all human possibilities of verbalization, all that we can try to refer with any word symbol. So in that sense, it is in Shankaracharya's commentary in different Upanishads like Mandukya, Brihadaranyaka, Chandogya, and so on, you find elaborate description, which I am not going to in details. I mentioned we have Mandukya Karika classes. The long elaborate classes are there, and also we have Bhashya classes. You can go to the Vedanta Society of San Francisco's or online system. So now coming to the subject, all word symbols have this fundamental principle on which they are based. One is, the more subtle, the more internally, the less verbally, that means the more internally that you pronounce it, you utter it, the greater, the deeper the effect. So if a prayer, if you utter or articulate internally without making a sound, but internally, then that prayer takes you deeper to the real meaning of that prayer. If you utter it very loudly, then to that extent, it takes you away from its essence. It is very good, of course, if a person can shout a psalm or a prayer. It's better, that way you'll be able to shut out all other Shabda Prapancha, means all other words and all other sounds you'll be able to shut out. You'll be able to focus on what you're uttering very loudly. But then the spiritual effect will be much less. So based on that principle, Japa is divided into Vachika, Upamshu and Manasika. So that means it can be called verbal, it can be called, when lips are moving, but the sound is not audible, but you actually pronounce the japa, but without the sound coming out, your lips may move. It is called upamshu. And the third one is manasika. When you don't even move your lips, of course no sound ever comes out, but the japa is going on internally as a natural process, and this is the most powerful way of uttering any prayer, any word symbol. I don't want to go into details, but you can see many of these in the classical Christian mystical tradition. In a more pronounced manner, you can find in the Russian Orthodox Church the Jesus prayer. Those who have read the well-known book, The Way of a Pilgrim, or The Pilgrim Continues His Journey, which are autobiographical writings belonging to the mid-19th century Russian Orthodox mystical tradition, you can find a pilgrim when he actually realized the reality of Jesus' prayer, then he found it's a natural phenomenon happening in his mind spontaneously, and that was the time when he realized the essence of it. Similarly, any prayer, any mantra, japa that you do in a very internal manner, it directly takes you to the highest spiritual experience. So these are three, of course, from a preliminary standpoint, three types of doing japa. One is vachika, which is of course very obvious, you utter it. The second one is upamshu. Upamshu is more subtle. I mean, you actually, your lips are moving, but it's a kind of low whispered voice. You don't hear it, but it is going on. And the highest is manasika, when it becomes an internal process. In the bhakti tradition, in the mantra japa tradition of Hinduism, this subject has been elaborately described and explained in different devotion classics that we can discuss later. So this is one. The second way of looking at is this one. First of all, there is a evolution taking place when you utter any mantra. It is para, pashyanti, madhyama, vaikhari. These are the 4 levels in a descending order. So we should begin with this in ascending order, which means the grossest and most preliminary, the beginning, the way of practicing japa is vaikhari, where you hear the sound when you utter any kind of mantra or prayer. You do it loudly, others hear it, you hear it. This is the beginning. This is the first stage. And then there is another stage, madhyama, where the sound is less, which means you are going deeper into the essence of the japa. When the sound comes down, that is true everywhere. You can find whole streets full of very big sound, shouting. That's wonderful actually. That is certainly a very wonderful, a grand way of beginning spiritual journey. If thousands of people can gather and chant some great prayers, meditate, anything, it is wonderful. But we should remember from a spiritual perspective, it is only the beginning. It is vaikhari. But, if that person goes to his room and sits there and starts chanting the same mantra, same sacred word, symbol, so that others may not hear, he may hear. It is called madhyama. Then pashyanti is a higher level, where it becomes a natural, internal, mental process. And para means when he identifies himself, when he reaches the experience level of the essence of the mantra that is reciting, that is para. So this is a very graphic description of how we go deeper and deeper into our own mind, our own spiritual life. As we advance further and further in our spiritual journey, we reach a higher and higher level of mantra japa. So that's why tad japaka dartha bhavanam. So adhikara bheda, it's called adhikari bheda, means those who are already familiar with the spiritual discipline, those who are already spiritually disciplined, like yamas and niyamas, all disciplines are well established. Such persons will be able to practice, begin his spiritual practice, let us say, with pashyanti or madhyama, and quickly, without much delay, go to para level. Of course, quickly it means, or delayed means taking several life cycles. That is the Vedantic yoga perspective. One will always reach the goal, but it may take time according to the called adhikari bheda, the level, the status of fitness, to what extent we have actually established ourselves in the 10 disciplines, that is yamas and niyamas. Ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha, shaucha, santosha, tapasvadhyaya, isvaridhana. These 10 disciplines, if a person is fully established in 10 disciplines, then actually pratyahara will be very easy, then dharana, dhyana also will be very easy. So this is an important. Here, what Patanjali has attempted is to give us a simple discipline to go into yoga practice, making use of that technique that Patanjali describes, that is called Ishvara Pranidhana, total resignation. In fact, this Ishvara Pranidhana, we should not get away with the impression that it is something that is mentioned only in Patanjali system or Hindu yoga tradition. Not at all. In the Christian tradition, in the theology, in the kenosis we call, Jesus submitted himself to the divine will. He didn't try, he didn't make his own attempt to save himself. The complete submission to the divine will. Surprisingly, Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor, goes on having his questions on this Jesus figure, but the Jesus figure never speaks. So there are theologians who try to interpret that as an example of kenosis, means pratipatti or sharanagati. The whole idea is being developed into a great, grand, philosophical, spiritual, psychological system in the devotional classics of Hinduism, Narada Bhakti Sutras, Shandilya Bhakti Sutras, the Bhagavata Purana, and so on. So this is all about Tajyapaha Tad Arthabhavanam. This is the important principle we should remember. Those who have got doubts, you can ask later. Next sutra is this one. Tataha pratikchedanadhigamo api antaraya abhavascha. So antaraya, we are going to discuss that very, very important subject in the next sutra, the 30th sutra. One of the great revelations that Patanjali has made in the Yoga Sutras. The 9 obstacles and distractions that every person may have to face in spiritual life. So the problem is, in social life, in our professional life, when we have a problem, an obstacle, a distraction, a setback, we have a very obvious way to confront that problem. If you don't have a job, if you don't have money, if you don't have health, there is a very obvious solution, a way to confront the problem in the social, in the empirical life. There's no problem. Because there is a benefit that is very obvious to us. You work hard, get a job, you know what reward you are going to get. You get a job, you get money, you get status, and so on. But what's the benefit you are going to get by practicing yamas and niyamas? There is no real obvious reward here, really speaking. So there, the problems are many more, distractions are many more. In the social life, in the social setting, there is a compulsion for us to confront the problem and solve the problem. But in our own spiritual life, there is a problem, there is no compulsion. So you find many more problems. So these problems are together called antarayaha, means distractions or obstacles in spiritual life, which we are going to discuss very soon when we discuss the 30th sutra. So in the 29th sutra, Patanjali says, Tataha, from this mantra japa, Omkara japa, practicing some kind of a prayer, means in a word symbol, and of course by meditating arthabhavana, by meditating on the meaning, the essence of that mantra, what happens? Pratyakchedana adhigamaha means our internal intelligence becomes clear, and all the dirt and filth and skepticism and negativity of the mind get completely removed, and we reach a stage where there are no distractions, no obstacles. It's called antaraya abhavaha, means absence of antaraya. So that is related to the next sutra which we are going to discuss now. That is, so we will take it up. The sutra is this: Vyadhi, Sthana, Samsaya, Pramada, Alasya, Avirati, Bhranti Darsana, Alabdha Bhumigatva, Anavasthidani, Chitta Vikshepaha, Te Antaraya. It's a long, very long sutra. vyadhi, sthana, samsaya, pramada, alasya, avirati, aradhabhumigatvam, etc. These are the obstacles, these are the problems that every person will have to encounter in spiritual life. These are psychological problems or obstacles in the path of yoga. Now, we may call vikshebas or distractions. Now we will discuss this subject one after another rather elaborately, of course with the help of Vyasa's commentary, this being an important sutra. So disease, kind of languor, that is indecision, carelessness, sloth, sensuality, mistaken notion, missing the point, instability. These are distractions. It's an important point. Now, of course, here Vyasa has written very, very important commentary, which is one of the celebrated parts of Yoga Sutra literature. Vyasa begins his commentary. After this, I will try to connect Vyasa's statements with our everyday psychological landscape, because frequently you find when you read and interpret these ancient ideas coming from ancient sages, and when we explain this in this 21st century, one may feel a kind of disconnect, because these terms had certain well-structured definitions and meanings in those times when these commentaries were written. But surprisingly, they are very real and very obvious when we interpret them in the context of our own times. So first the commentary. Bhashyam atha ke antarayaha ye chittasya vikshepakaha ke punaste kriyanto va iti. So this is the sutra. What are these impediments? What are the obstacles? In other words, put in simple context, when we apply for a job, when we make an appointment to go to the Kaiser, to medical appointment, or when we engage in our everyday professional duties and responsibilities, of course we may face obstacles, but we always succeed in confronting the obstacles, because, as I mentioned earlier, there's a problem that is obvious and there's a need to solve the problem that is also obvious, and therefore there is a solution. But these distractions are different. Now, Vyasa's greatness was that he brings in the God idea, Ishvara Pradhana, as an important tool to solve all these problems. Psychologically, what happens, when we can resign, when we can surrender all our activities to some higher sublime purpose, which is basically God's will, God's grace, etc., then you find a huge burden is taken off our shoulders. Of course, we should remember, and this is very important to remember, the God idea in the Yoga Sutra is somewhat different from what it has come to me in many of the theological debates and discussions. It is not a God idea that threatens you with punishment, that promises reward for your actions. That the whole concept has to be altered. So that's why the Yoga Sutra has got a very, very secular context. Relevance also to our times. So God is here considered to be an embodiment of sublime, universal compassion, equality, and something that is very logically understandable, logically intelligible, even in the context of everyday life. So Vyasa says, Navantarayaha chittasya vikshepaha sahayedi chittavrittibhi bhavanti. Now he says, these 9 obstacles of the mind, they exist, they arise only when there are fluctuations. These different vrittis creating problems in our mind. So once we reduce these vrittis, then the fluctuations also will gradually decrease and disappear altogether. Vyadhi. First one is Vyadhi. Vyadhi is Dhadu Rasa Karana Vaishamyam. That is Vyasa's definition. Now, this is interpreted mostly by some commentators in the light of the Ayurvedic concept of health, mental and physical health. Sama dosha samagdischa samadhatu malakriyaha prasannatmendriya mana sustha iti abhidhiyate. It's a definition in the Ayurvedic tradition. So, when your metabolism, when your senses, when your mind, when they are all in a state of perfect balance, that is the state of perfect health. When they are in a state of imbalance, called Vaishamyam, Vyadhi, Dhadurasa, Karana Vaishamyam. There is an imbalance, disharmony, mutual conflict. See, mind doesn't agree. Well, it comes, physically you are healthy, but mind somehow doesn't cooperate. That's what we are going to discuss that state of that problem is discussed, is already included in these 9 distractions elaborately. Body is healthy, no problem. Mind is not willing. So one may sit in a room, an easy chair, may lay down. Mind somehow doesn't feel very enthusiastic. Another context. You are very enthusiastic, want to do a lot, but mind doesn't cooperate. Very aged persons, 90 years, 95 years, want to do great things, mind. But body doesn't cooperate. So these are real problems that we find. Now, when it comes to a physical activity in the empirical social context, it may somehow resolve the problem. But when this laziness, the non-cooperation of the mind becomes a problem, well, I don't want to meditate, but I can rather sit and read some comic books or watch some thriller or something. That is fine. So mind, so alasyam, aviradhi, etc., all these are mentioned here. Heaviness of mind, all these you find mentioned here. So in a way, the mental attitude or disregard or indifference is only with regard to spiritual practices. Otherwise, mind is okay. So, that's that. There, mind also should be in perfect harmony. Sthana, akarmanyada, chittasya. Just as I mentioned, chittasya akarmanyada means, karmanyada means enthusiasm. I shall do it, etc. Ready to act. The opposite, akarmanyada, means body is healthy, it can do a lot of things. Somehow mind doesn't show much enthusiasm. That's an error. You can find this. For any activity, mind will be ready. But sitting somewhere, meditating or contemplating, or even reading a very wonderful book, or even to listen to lectures like this, which actually discuss all about going to a higher level of our own evolution, actually. Mind may not find this sort of lectures very entertaining. For many people, certainly there is no entertainment here, actually. There is absolutely no thriller, nothing that will tilt our senses. nothing eye-catching. So in order to be interested in reading a good book, in watching a great movie that actually may be helpful in our spiritual life, in listening to some prayers or reading a prayer, the mind suddenly, no, I would rather read something, a comic novel right now. Tomorrow onwards I wish to. And some commentators mention, surprisingly, very close on the heels of modern psychology, procrastination, a tendency to postpone indefinitely. Whenever we want to do certain things which will be for the betterment of our own spiritual life, immediately a tendency to procrastinate, to postpone, mind playing tricks. So that is why akarmanyata chittasya, that Vyasa says. That is sthana. Samshaya, ubhaya kodis prik vijnana means, well, an attitude. Syadva, syadnava means, oh, it may be so, it may not be so. All right, maybe not. Somebody, well, I may or I may not meditate. Now, such persons will never be able to really meditate, really speaking. Of course, this applies to all spheres of life, but in other spheres, in social obligations or professional obligations, one day we may have to come to settlement. We have to do, otherwise you may not be able to pay your electricity bill or you may not be able to pay your rent. But in spiritual life, maybe, may not be. I may meditate or I may not meditate. It's called ubhayagodis prakvijnanam. That is samsaya. Skepticism could be one manifestation of this tendency. Self-doubt can be a manifestation. Tendency to question everything, not because we want to clarify a point, but because we are not willing to do that. So we question. That's an important thing. So remember, there are two types of questioning tendencies. We want to clarify this point so that I can solve this problem. This is one. Another one is we want to question because we don't want to accept this. Not that we do not accept, but we do not want to accept this. Mind actually plays a trick. In our internal mind, the line of demarcation is not very clear. But actually, we may be showing our unwillingness to accept, not because we do not accept, but because we do not want to accept something that we know to be true, but we may not be willing to accept. So that is samsaya, ubhayakodi, maybe or may not be attitude. Syadi devamedam naivam syadidi. So syad evam naivam evam na syad. Either it may be so, it may not be so. That's Vyasa's commentary. Aviratihi chittasya vishaya samprayogatma gaddha means avirati. A kind of maybe not thinking of the process for concentration, maybe disinclination arising out of heaviness of the body and mind, not abstention arises out of a thirst for or addiction to worldly objects, etc. Vishaya samprayogatma, because mind is addicted to worldly objects, so non-abstention. I'm not being able to practice abstention. I mean to keep away from worldly objects. That is avirati. Pranti darshanam, viparya jnanam. It is a wrong conception. Again, we should not mistake that this is a kind of intellectual phenomenon. It's a natural tendency to see the wrong side of things, or to interpret, to recognize and interpret the right for the wrong and the wrong for the right. That is also a very deep internal process. It's not due to lack of intellectual understanding. Patanjali's psychology goes much deeper. So he is not talking about our lack of intellect, our ability, or lack of ability or inability to understand things. No. Rather, it goes deeper. We understand things, but our mind shows a tendency to interpret the wrong way. We may not show that problem in the context of our everyday professional or social context. We may show that problem when our mind shows an unwillingness to actually do something which we are not used to, meditation. So we can see if somebody decides tomorrow onwards I shall meditate, or I shall start reading some good books, or this can, of course, can have deeper implications, even in the context of addiction, smoking, drug addiction. I'm not just smoking drugs and alcoholism and drug addiction, some of the problems of obsession with the internet, computer games, many of these, some of them take diabolical manifestations in modern times, especially with students and people, really speaking. They take diabolical forms in modern times, suicidal forms, so to speak. Extreme obsession with certain practices which actually give us some temporary, momentary pleasure, or just engagement. It could be in the form of computer games, and there are many, of course, different forms of different manifestations, some of them very, 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 very dangerous. All these are different manifestations of the games that mind plays with itself. We play with our own mind. This happens. Now, Patanjali may not have anticipated what we are witnessing in the 21st century, but the great truth is that what is said, or what Vyasa, of course, this comes from Vyasa. Vyasa wrote as a great implication to our own times. Our own mind taking us along the wrong and frequently the suicidal road, the suicidal path leading to self-destruction, mentally, physically, even. So these are different games with mind that mind plays with itself. We do not know why Vyasa wrote this commentary. Vyasa comes in the first in the line of great commentators. Most probably, of course, in some of the commentaries, Vyasa says that once we get an awareness of these, then we can avoid the problems. And in all these contexts, surprisingly, he gives so much of importance to Ishvara Pranidhana. Submitting to divine will. So it is essentially a very theistic approach you find. Some kind of a higher ideal in life. Even for people who are intellectually not willing to accept a created God idea, still even they can very easily submit to a higher purpose, to a higher ideal. Of course, the best thing is for those who believe in God to practice some degree of Ishvara Pranidhana. As I mentioned in my class during interaction, during the question and answer last session, somebody asked this question. Ishvara Pranidhana is mentioned in the first sutra of Sadhanapada, where Patanjali defines Kriya Yoga, Tapa Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhananani Kriya Yoga. That is one Ishvara Pranidhana, where what Patanjali, according to commentators, what Patanjali indicates is Bhakti Yoga, practicing or developing some devotional disciplines. And also, of course, some higher spiritual ideas. that's a path through which you enter spiritual life. But here, what Patanjali says is, even if we cannot fully get established yamas and niyamas, still, if we can surrender ourselves to a divine will, that's why I compare to this kenosis idea in the Christian theology. Of course, remember, it is in the strictly in the Christian theological context, it is related to Jesus emptying himself of his own special spiritual powers and submitting himself completely to the divine will. And he didn't try to save himself. I'm not limiting the implication to that Christian theological context. But idea of submitting to a higher purpose, emptying ourselves and connecting ourselves to a higher purpose, that will help us to get rid of many of these psychological distractions. Then alasyam kayasya chittasya cha gurutvad apravrittihi. So, laziness kayasya chittasya cha. The literal meaning is you feel heavy. Physically and mentally you feel heavy. So it is actually a feeling of laziness. Again, the deep-rooted cause could be linked to either samshaya or sthana, karmanyada, indifference to actually practice, and also this kind of skeptical attitude which may make the body and mind feel heavy. Of course, this can also mean some kind of a physical problem. Maybe that's related to vada, pitta, kapha, etc. Of course, commentators sometimes link this to the Ayurvedic concept of when the body is very heavy, when you don't feel much enthusiasm, the bodily condition influences the mind also. So mind also becomes indifferent. So that is also one possibility is there. But it is also possible for one to feel lazy or indifferent when our mind is not actually able to practice it. So this is one. Aviradi chittasya vishay samprayogatma gadha I mentioned. Pranti darshanam viparya jnanam, that we mentioned already. Alabdha bhumigattum samadhi bhumehi alapha. That is non-attainment of any yogi stage means not, you feel that you are not fully firmly established in any of the yoga stages. That actually is also a mental phenomenon. We feel we are not making enough progress. There are two levels where this could happen. As a distraction, as an antaraya, it could happen. And also as a result of extreme sincerity and practice also, one may feel a kind of dissatisfaction with what one has already achieved and want to do more and to advance further in spiritual life. That is also one state. But here it is mostly a kind of pathological self-doubt, a feeling that, well, still I have not attained anything, still I am not making any progress, this kind of attitude. That's why it is called antarayas. There's an important. You find many great spiritual seekers, devotees, feeling dissatisfied. You find in the Bhagavata Purana, Prahlada, a little boy of 5 years, is a great devotee. The greatest devotee of Bhagavata Purana is the son of a demon. And his father was his worst enemy, in fact. And he became, according to Sri Ramakrishna, Prahlada is the greatest devotee in the Bhagavata Purana. So Prahladaschata Daityanam, he belonged to that clan of demons class, so to speak. But that boy was the greatest devotee of God. And he was always in a state of communion with the divine. But sometimes he felt, well, I'm still away from God. And sometimes he felt, well, he's close to God. So that kind of feeling, this is not antaraya, remember. That is the natural feeling of a very great devotee who feels always, he wants to be always in communion with God. So if there is the least separation, he feels terribly dissatisfied. That's not the implication here. Here is in the pathological mental condition where a person, he constantly nags, kind of nagging situation. But I'm not making any progress. I'm not making any progress. I'm not able to do anything. That's also an antaraya, a mental distraction that should be got rid of. So once a person submits himself to God's will, when he won't have any complaint, even if he's not making any progress. It's God's will that I'm not making enough progress. So why should I complain? So this problem will not be there. So that's why alabdhabhumigatvam will not be there. Anavasthitatvam yalabdhayam bhumau chittasya apradishtha. Inability to remain in a state, to failure, inability or the failure to maintain the attained state, the state that they already attained, the person feels. I mean, suddenly there is a distraction. Again, there is a change. The person feels that he is not able to remain in that state. Samadhi pradilambhe hi tadavasthidam syat ityede chitta vikshepaha nava yogamala. So of course, taking the clue from Patanjali, Vyasa says, ede nava chittamala. These are the 9 types of mental filter, dirt. That's the meaning. Means things to be removed. What is dirt? Dirt is something to be removed by cleaning. Like chittamala is something that should be removed from mind, from chitta. Now, these are some of the great writings in the Vyasa Bhashya, where Vyasa gives a very scientific and very profound analysis of how sometimes our mind plays tricks. We cannot really analyze every single of distraction and try to solve. What we must do, we should not think about any of the distractions. We need not worry about, I will not move to the east, I will not move to the east. We should straight away start moving to the west. The only way to solve the problem is to move in the right direction. We need not worry about the problem of by mistake moving the opposite direction. We should move in the right direction, the proper direction. That is Ishvara Pranidhana, as mentioned here. So, of course, there are different views here, for example, Vyadhi, according to Bhoja. Bhoja was a great writer. He was a king. He wrote Rajamartanda, where he writes, Dhaudu Vaishamyam. That's what he says. Second is taken from Ayurveda, etc. Now, these are 9 distractions, more or less psychological, internal distractions that we discussed till now. Now, these 9 distractions can manifest in 4 different ways. That is mentioned in the 31st sutra that we'll discuss now. That is dukkha daumanasya angame jayatva swasa praswasaha vikshepa sahabhuvaha. That means they come along with vikshepas. Those whose mind is vikshipta. Vikshipta means moving in one way and then moving another way. We should remember this. In this context, we should know that at the beginning of the class, we discussed these 5 levels of mental functions. Depending upon the way in which mental vrittis actually function in our system, there are 5 levels. That is Kshipta, Mudha, Vikshipta, Ekagra and Niruddha. 5 states of human mind based on the functions of vrittis. I shall try to explain this again to bring it to the context. Kshipta and Mudha are actually abnormal states. Restlessness, extreme restlessness or extreme inactivity. Both can be. Maybe you may call it it's more or less bipolar, or it would be either depression, it could be one, melancholia, total inactivity, or maybe hyperactivity. These are 2 abnormal states. The 3rd state corresponds to the normal human mind, that is Vikshipta. Vikshipta means number of vrittis are there in the mind. Good vrittis, bad vrittis. Good tendencies, bad tendencies. Very wonderful tendencies, very wonderful characteristics, memories, impressions, and also some very undesirable, unhelpful memories and tendencies. So when we go to a temple or a church or a place of worship, we may feel utter peace and tranquility. When we discuss some of these great ideas, we may feel great enthusiasm, spiritual enthusiasm. But after some time, it is gone. Again it may come back, but again it can disappear. This fluctuation. That is for the common man, any person for that matter. For such a person, Patanjali says, there can be 4 types of the external manifestations of the 9 distractions that we already discussed. That's subject of discussion in the 31st Sutra. That is pain, despair, shakiness and a kind of extreme inspiration and expiration. I mean, again it's a kind of anxiety, hyperactivity and so on. This is what happens. If we have got doubt, we may feel internal pain. If we got so much of anxiety due to samsaya, due to vyadhi, due to sthana that you mentioned, one may feel this, the breathing system can be in a state of imbalance. Again, shakiness, all these can be different manifestations of the 9 obstacles we discussed. Anyway, we will discuss that in the coming class. Now we can have interactions. Please remember, we should always know that Patanjali is trying to explain problems that we normally encounter when we try to seek a higher ideal in our life. That is the context. But going beyond that, it has got a universal application, because many people can understand their own mind and soul. Many of the problems, once they come to know how our mind can play games with ourselves, that's the real benefit. We can have interaction. Most welcome. Thank you.
Pranava Maharaj,
yeah.
I have a question. So, the person who is going to realize God, he has to have a very strong mind. So he says that I will realize God and I will conquer all my laziness and I will concentrate for long hours.
Yes, correct.
So, and he will do that. So he is taking all the onus on himself, on his mind. But at the same time, Patanjali is saying Ishvara Pranidhana. That means you cannot now rely on yourself to get God, but you have to give up and say that everything is God's will, and the realization is dependent on His will, not my will. So that is too contradictory, very contradictory.
No,
how do you explain that?
No, it's not really not a contradiction. Here Patanjali is actually giving a solution to spiritual seekers who are not able even to take that decision, I shall realize God. That doesn't come to everyone. A strong person, a highly evolved person, if he takes such a decision, he must have already gone beyond all these antarayas, obstacles. Patanjali is here talking about those who cannot even concentrate a little, sitting somewhere, meditate, or think of yamas or niyamas, practicing all this. You practice santosha, for example, one of the niyamas, but then suddenly you feel dissatisfied. So actually it's against it. I will practice contentment. Next minute we may feel discontentment. It could happen. So how to do that? So people may suddenly feel, oh, may have happened, may not happen. Maybe mind also becomes lazy, because when you face obstacles in spiritual life, actually many people may have a tendency to run away from spiritual ideal at all, from spiritual life. When you read a wonderful book, any spiritual classic, you may feel great interest, but next day you may not show that interest. That is vikshipta chitta. That's why these antarayas, these obstacles happen to a person who is a vikshipta chittasya, means a person whose chitta, whose mind is fluctuating, not very settled. You mentioned a strong devotee, well, I shall realize God, like Buddha, who left his palace, right, everything, right. Buddha doesn't need to read Patanjali Yoga Sutras. You know that? Patanjali didn't write for Buddha, actually. Just remember. A Buddha doesn't need that. So you have to remember this very well. Those who have got such a strong mind, in fact, for them none of the antarayas will apply. Patanjali is coming down to a common spiritual seeker who may be interested now in something great, and maybe tomorrow, oh, let me, syadva, oh, maybe I may not be, I won't bother. Again, next day again he may show interest. So instability, samsaya, for example. Or maybe he may become inactive. Oh, he may become lazy. And I tell you, it's a fact, if you read, and that's why it's important to read other Narada Bhakti Sutras, in Chandilya Bhakti Sutras, or, because this is in Sanskrit, translations are available, or those who are interested can read again this the well-known book, Saint Teresa Avila's autobiographical writings. She talks about suddenly her mind becoming distrust. She suddenly she feels that she is losing her faith, and again she gets activated. You can find this. You find in the autobiographical writings of many spiritual seekers. You find, or if you just read what all letters Swami Tattwamayananda ji had to answer. Swami Tattwamayananda, who came to Shanti Ashrama. These letters you can find. People used to write to him. Now sometimes I feel depressed. What should I do? And so on. So actually, it's a real fact. So whatever this Nava Antaraya, the 9 distractions that the Patanjali has listed out here, all these 9 distractions you will find sometimes haunt people. They torment spiritual seekers. Actually, so very often Tattwamayananda ji writes, you feel these distractions because that shows your sincerity. You recognize a problem to be a problem. In fact, to be able to recognize a problem to be a problem, you should have already started your spiritual journey. You should have already done some spiritual practice to be able to recognize a problem. So you go ahead. So you find in many of the writings, you can find Swami Brahmananda ji's writings, how he replies to the disciples who frequently wrote to him expressing the problems. And you find in the centers of Avila's writings. Of course, a kind of monologue, it's soliloquy. She suddenly expresses doubt. So it's very common nowadays. So all these 9 distractions are very common for a spiritual seeker till he makes some substantial progress. It's not for Buddha. The Patanjali did write this Yoga Sutras for Buddhas to study and practice. Buddha was greater than Patanjali, to be that's a reality. Buddha was far greater than Patanjali. Of course, I'm not comparing, in a half light way I'm telling. So, many of the great Buddhists themselves studied Yoga Sutras. The Mahayana Buddhism, there are 2 schools. One is the Vijnanavada, the practice Yoga Vijnanavada, and of course Shunyavada. So many of them practiced yoga disciplines. So please remember that. It is meant for Vikshipta Chitta, those whose minds are fluctuating. For them, these antarayas are natural. That's the idea behind.
At Buddha's time, Patanjali Yoga Sutra was available.
Not Buddha, but many Buddhists from 2nd century to about 5th century, 6th century, many of them, the Vijnanavadins especially, many of them gave a lot of importance to the practice of yoga disciplines. We do not know. Most probably Patanjali was before Buddha, of course. And remember, surprisingly, if you look at Buddha's posture, actually he is sitting on Padmasana.
Yeah.
And he is also doing his mudras. So Buddha's picture, if you see, or even the Vardhamana Mahavira, who was a senior contemporary of Buddha, the founder of Jaina religion, 30 years before Buddha. They were more or less contemporaries. We don't know whether they met each other. Both were princes. So his posture also, if you look at Vardhamana Mahavira, Jaina teacher, all yoga postures only. Buddha is sitting in Padmasana actually. He is sitting in Padmasana. So most probably Patanjali lived long before Buddha. We do not know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Ishvara is Kalena Avacheda.
Yeah.
Beyond the time, when Purusha attains Kaivalyam, I assume the Purusha is also beyond the time.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the attainer of Kaivalya and Ishvara?
Yeah. Purusha and Prakriti are 2 eternal fundamental categories in yoga philosophy. Of course, in Sankhya philosophy also. Purusha is effulgence, Chaitanya, and Prakriti is Jada. The Ishvara here, according to Patanjali system, Ishvara is the great ancestor teacher, those who have already gone beyond all this and who have reached the highest state of Kaivalya. And so he has reached that state of Purveshamapi Guru in that sense. So remember, Purusha and Ishvara are 2 different entities. Yoga system accepts 3 categories actually, and unlike Sankhya system. Purusha, Prakriti and Ishvara. Ishvara is an additional category the yoga system alone accepts, not in Sankhya system. So Ishvara, according to Patanjali system, is the great teacher. He who had already practiced all this, who have gone beyond all ignorance, beyond all vrittis, all vasanas, who have reached the highest spiritual realization. So he is called Guru. So, in the commentators will tell you, he is the first guru or the greatest ancestor guru from whom these practices evolved. That's how yoga practitioners are supposed to look at it. Whether it's a personal or impersonal, Patanjali system doesn't make very clear. Patanjali is not very clear about that. He should be understood as supreme guru, supreme teacher. And once we surrender ourselves, resign ourselves to that Ishvara, then our own deficiencies in the practice of yamas and niyamas will be corrected. These deficiencies can be removed, and we will be able to make progress. Especially the most direct benefit of this Ishvara Pranidhana is removal of antarayas and chitta vikshepas, which are mentioned in the 30th Sutra and 31st Sutra.
Pranava Maharaj, this is Isha from Canada, Calgary. I just am wondering about the difference, the distinction between the Ayurvedic concept of illness or wellness, because you talked about the Vyadhi definition, and the Yoga Sutras, but you said that there is a difference. So where would the difference be? Like Ayurveda, if it says that it depends on the Vata, Pitta nature of a person, how would yoga define it?
Now, yoga, the Patanjali's yoga system doesn't clearly elaborate the condition of perfect physical health, but it elaborates the condition of perfect mental health. In that context, Patanjali uses the chitta prasada. So a mind that is established in its own harmony, its own internal harmony and peace and tranquility, is actually at peace with itself. And Vata, Pitta and Kapha are related to body and indirectly related to mind also, of course. It affects. But Patanjali system doesn't deal with that. That's what I mentioned. I didn't imply there is a fundamental difference or not. Of course, what I quoted was from Susuddha Sutta. So, if you are an Ayurvedic scientist, so to speak, that's the idea behind. Patanjali doesn't directly deal with the science of physical health. No. Of course, his practices may be helpful for physical health, but it doesn't deal with the subject as, the way an Ayurvedic teacher like Charaka, Susuddha and others deal with. That's the idea behind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Swamiji Pranam.
Yeah, namaskar.
I had a question. So when we talk about Raja Yoga, is Raja Yoga essentially following the steps of Patanjali?
Yeah.
Doing the Ashtanga Yoga?
Yeah. Now, Raja Yoga is, historically, the first time Raja Yoga is mentioned or implied is Gita, in the second chapter. Imam vivasade yogam proktavanaham avayam vivaswan manave praha manu ikshakavya bravi evam parampara praptam imam rajasya viduhu sakalena yogo mahada yogo nashta parandava. So, mahada kalena yogaha nashtaha. In course of time this yoga was lost. What kind of yoga? It was something that was practiced by Rajarshi, the kings. So that's the first implication. Now, according to Swami Vivekananda and many modern writers, Raj Yoga literally means Ashtanga Yoga. These great sages, were philosopher kings, Rajarshi, great Janaka and Ashupati and Panchala, many of the kings mentioned in the Upanishad literature, they were great practitioners of yoga. Ashtanga Yoga. Through Ashtanga Yoga, they attained perfect mastery over themselves, over their own mind, and attained yoga. And therefore, they could, on the one hand, rule their kingdom as great kings would rule a kingdom. And at the same time, they had the wisdom of a sage, a rishi. That's the idea behind. Both rishi and raja. Rajanasya, rishesya, rajasya. Rajarshis are those who are kings and also rishis rolled into one. So they had the wisdom of a sage and the kingly dynamism, efficiency of a ruler or king. Philosopher king idea. Plato's philosophy king idea. So Raja Yoga normally can be taken to be this Ashtanga Yoga. But at the same time, in its more elaborate interpretations, there are people who link Raj Yoga not only with Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga but also with Tantra and other subjects also. So in the Upanishad literature, the great Rajarshis were also great teachers of Vedanta. Janaga, Ashwapati, Panchala, many Ajatashatru. You find all these great kings who are also great teachers of Vedanta, Vedantic truth in the Upanishadic tradition. So that's why some scholars link Raja Yoga to Patanjali's system, to Tantra and also to Vedanta. Maybe that's the most comprehensive way of understanding it. Yeah. But its practical aspect must be, I think, Ashtanga Yoga. Self-mastery, going beyond the mental fluctuations, getting a grip over your own mind, your own emotions, your own feelings. Self-restraint and self-control. That's the essence of Raja Yoga. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you. So, most welcome, and I shall conclude. So we continue this subject again next week. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.